Okay, good. Continue. Good afternoon, friends and newcomers to our Friday special conversations with special people. I'm so happy to introduce our very special guest today, Alex Torpy. Alex was a former village president of South Orange at the age of 23, founded Veracity Media, and has a podcast now called Rethinking with Alex Torpy, which he will tell us soon about his travels. Alex first spoke here on February 25th, 2016 on the topic, the importance of community in modern times. And now you can talk about the importance of communities all over in modern times. Today's topic is travels with Torpy. Alex, you're a very busy man, and I can't wait to hear all about your new endeavor. And I appreciate your giving your time here very much. So please now let us give a very warm welcome to our very special guest, Alex Torpy. Alex, it's yours. And Alex, would you just explain one thing? Seriously, tell about a podcast, because there's a lot of people who do not use computers. And so podcasts are something that's not familiar with them.
I'll talk a little bit about that. Thank you, Phyllis. And I'm thank you for doing these series. I don't know if everybody knows, Phyllis, I'm sure you know this, but when I came back to South Orange after going to college and moved back to town, the first thing that I got involved with in South Orange was actually joining the library board. It was sort of my first way of getting involved. I don't think I knew or anybody else knew that I'd be running for village president 2 years later. But it was like a really wonderful sort of starting point for me, just getting to know everybody in the library, working on some local history projects. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that kind of stuff in a minute. And so it was just like a really great sort of introduction to me. And as a user of libraries myself, I enjoyed getting to kind of, participate in the library board way. And so I always have a special place in my heart for the library in South Orange, because it was, my first way of really getting involved in town. And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about first, if it looks odd, the background here, I know there's a couple of you who are on video, and I'll try to use my words to describe where I am, but my guess is they will fall short. And so I'm in Montana right now, driving across the country, and this is sort of the view out here. So this is the road that I am parked on. I'm in the southern part of Montana near Yellowstone. And what's in the background there, for those of you on the phone, is sort of a blue skies up top. And I'm in sort of a valley. So there's mountains on either side, and these sort of very rocky mountains at the very end of this road. And so a few miles down this road is where I've been camping. And I came out here to find a spot to get some cell phone service so I could do this. But the area here in Montana, and apparently this behind us here, is one of the largest wilderness preserves in the US. And so it's a couple different national forests and national parks and different protected lands that are all next to each other. And it's tens of thousands of square miles of completely uninhabited, pristine, barely touched by human hands nature, which is really incredible. And so what I'll do is just share a little bit about the podcast Phyllis mentioned, travels, a few thoughts that I've had, and then actually, I have a question for anybody who's on and wants to kind of participate too. So as Phyllis mentioned, I started a podcast. I think the best way to explain a podcast is it's basically like a radio show, but instead of being on the radio, it's just on the internet. And so for my show, basically the topics that I'm trying to cover are things related to how we govern, and how we think about how communities work, how we think about how societies are put together, and all that kind of stuff. I'm sure at a few points I'll be interrupted by some insects in here. I would have sat outside, but it's a little too windy, so I don't think you'd be able to hear me. So the podcast is trying to understand how we govern, but through understanding ourselves a little bit better. And so why do we have Why do we have the preferences that we do? Why do we make the decisions that we do? Why did we decide to build governments and economies in the way that we actually did? Was that the only way it could have happened, or were there lots of choices and we're just sort of living along one branch of this timeline? And so trying to understand what's going on in our heads a little bit to try and understand how that affects the kinds of communities that we live in. So it's funny because it really is relevant to the talk that we did. I guess that was 5 years ago now. The importance of community, which is something that's always been really important to me to understand, and is important, I think, in part because of growing up in towns like South Orange. And so that's what the podcast is about. It's basically a discussion, sometimes interviews with other people, and it's all meant to try and help people better understand their own minds, better understand the minds of other people, better understand how we create the environments that companies are in, that nonprofits are in, that governments are in, and how can we all figure out ways to sort of do this a little bit better. And part of what I wanted to do for that was sort of get a little out of New Jersey, especially after being so isolated for the last year, and get out into the rest of the country and try to understand what's happening in other parts of the country. What's happening in communities? How have they responded to what the last year has been like, which has been difficult, but in different ways for so many of us. And trying to understand what governments are doing, what are individuals doing, what are community groups doing, what are the challenges that people are facing, and are there more things that we can sort of learn from each other than it seems like? That's one of the sort of questions here. And I think the answer to that is yes. There's a lot that we can learn, and it's hard if you, certain news channels or on the internet, it seems like everybody is at odds with each other, right? It seems like we have these gaps, and people are, there's people over here and people over there, and that's just what it is. And we're just sort of fighting between which of these two sides gets to be in power for 4 years, and then the other side, and then the other side. And I wanted to try and understand, well, is this division, is this really something that is in that is ingrained in each of us? Is this something that we're made to believe exists? And what I find when going to different places, and I'll share a couple examples of some conversations I've had so far, but what I always seem to find is that there is much more that we have in common, much more alignment than it seems like. And so one example might be, I have a friend and a colleague in Montana who was also elected to office at a very young age. I think he was 23, or I think he was 23, and he was elected to the state legislature in Montana. And we were talking about some different places for me to visit and people to talk to. And he mentioned some of the development that was happening in Bozeman, Montana, which is a place that some of you might have heard of. It's one of the couple bigger cities in Montana. Still pretty small for Northeast standards. But there's been a lot of people moving to Bozeman. There's been a lot of new stores, a lot of things changing, and the development that's happening, some people feel really good about it, that it's like bringing more money and more people into the community. And some people feel like it's sort of erasing some of the culture that was already there. And there are people who are on the more conservative end of the political spectrum in Montana saying, hey, this is getting away from us. There was a real culture in this community, and we're just sort of putting a mall on top of it. And why are we doing that? And what's interesting, I think, is that if you look at some of the things that happen near us, whether in New York, like in Brooklyn, whether in Newark or Camden or Trenton, or Philadelphia, you'll find people more on the end of the spectrum worried about the same thing in those communities, that there were cultures that were there that people are basically just building a mall on top of. And one of the things, this is one of the areas where I've just sort of realized that there is a lot of shared frustration and shared goals as far as how do we have a community that's maybe seen better days. There are communities in Montana that used to be coal mining communities that don't have any of those jobs anymore. And we have even some of that in the Northeast in Pennsylvania. You have places that have changed, and the way that we change them now, it doesn't really seem to be helping the people that were already there, but using that community as a place to bring other people into. And so people are moving out of bigger cities like a New York to a place like Bozeman and transforming it into what they just came from, but it's less expensive and it's in the mountains. And so we don't do a very good job in this country of investing money into communities while preserving, understanding and preserving elements of the community and culture and history that were already there. And so that's an example of one of the issues that I'm trying to understand better by visiting some of these different places, talking to people on, all different sides of what they think about things like that, and just trying to figure out, is there a way that we could do this better? Because I think one of the realities around us, something that I've been thinking a lot about on this trip so far is, so when I visited Fargo, North Dakota, there was a couple cool things that I got to meet a whole bunch of people there because I had a friend, another young elected official, who I think she was also elected when she was 23. And she sort of introduced me to some people in Fargo. And for example, the person who I stayed with there, so I rented a room through Airbnb, which I'm sure most of you know, it's, instead of staying in a hotel, you can just rent someone's house or apartment, or the room in their house or apartment. And what's really fun about that is that you get to meet people who actually live in these places. And so the person whose house that I was renting a room in for a couple nights was a very active community volunteer. And actually, his job up until very recently was working for a nonprofit in Fargo, North Dakota, connecting senior citizens in the community to volunteer opportunities in the community. And so they would find places that need help with things and find seniors who have the right time commitment and skill set and different things. And he would help connect the dots on that. And was very involved in his neighborhood association in Fargo for 20 years. So it was an interesting conversation I got to have with this person. And then I met somebody else who was an attorney and was involved in some historic preservation work in Fargo. And what he showed me was really interesting. And I'm going to try and pull up a picture here and see if this works. So unfortunately, I don't have all my pictures available. And so I'm not going to be able to show what the building looks like now. But this is a biscuit and cracker factory in Fargo, North Dakota. From this colored in photograph was from about 80 or 90 years ago. And if you can't see it, it's sort of a brick stately building in near the downtown in Fargo. And it was a major kind of cracker and biscuit producer that shipped them all over the country, especially out in the West, more than 100 years ago. And so this attorney moved into an office, this building that no longer, the company isn't there anymore. It's been, many decades since the company has closed. And this attorney moved into an office inside of this building, but he wanted to understand the history of the building. And so he went through all the records and went to the local government offices and went to the county government offices and actually hired an artist to help restore some of these photographs, that some of them are about 80, 90, 100 years old. And the photographs had some damage to it or something was blurry, and he would piece together from other photographs of the same place and time what the wagon looked like or what the car looked like, and then they would recreate that to make these really nice color pictures of this area. And he wanted to understand the history of the building that he was now working in as, you know, an attorney doing land use work. And over the last year or so, I've had that thought a lot. I've been living in Hunterdon County in New Jersey. And I was renting in a house that was over 200 years old. We're not sure exactly how old it was, but I couldn't fit through a bunch of the doorways, and I'm only 5'11". And so the house was built in a different time. The property records say it was built in 1800, although the guesses are that it was somewhere in the early 1800s. And I couldn't help but sit in that house and think about the fact that people lived in that same living room that I was sitting in. There was somebody sitting in that living room 200 years ago. They didn't have electricity. There were no trains. There were no computers. There were no phones. It was potentially before the Civil War happened. People were sitting in the same living room that I'm sitting in. And I try to imagine what their life was like in this very same room. And then I start wondering if they were ever wondering what my life was like. Were they sitting there 200 years ago thinking what it was going to be like in 200 years for somebody to be living in this very same house? And how many of us really think about, we think about the past sometimes, but Phyllis and I, we were talking a little bit before we sort of started here about how much I love science fiction. And one of the reasons why is because it sort of does that for the history, but for the future. Now we're guessing a little bit, although we're guessing with history too sometimes, or using our best guesses to know what happened. But I like thinking about not just what happened, 100 years before or 200 years before in the building that my office might be in or in the house that I might be renting, but what is that going to be like in 100 years or in 200 years? And what's sort of amazing about all of this, and especially about being out in places like this, is that we seem to like to surround ourselves with the idea that things can be permanent. We like having permanent looking houses and buildings that we're in. We like if we can have job security with permanence, right? And a pension or retirement plan with permanence, investing our money with permanence, signing legal contracts for our personal relationship for permanence, all of these different things that we do to try and make things feel solid and make them feel permanent. But even these mountains behind me out here, these mountains are not permanent. They are moving and changing every year. And it might be small enough that we can't really notice it, but it's happening. And over a larger time scale, we can see that mountains are moving, the seas are moving, the glaciers that formed a lot of the mountains in New Jersey, those were moving many miles per year, which is amazing to think about, a chunk of ice thousands of feet high moving multiple miles a year. And all of these things are moving. I mean, we feel like we're on a planet that is standing still, but the planet, as we all know now, and sometimes take for granted knowing, right? We know that we're on a planet that's moving in more directions than one of those, rides at an amusement park. And yet it seems like it's all standing still. And so that's just something that I've been sort of turning over in my mind a little bit over the last week or two, is why we want things to feel as permanent as we seem to want them to. And can we, are we afraid of things being in motion? Are we afraid of things changing, even though we ourselves only exist because of change over hundreds of thousands and millions of years on this planet? And so it's hard to argue that change is bad in that sense. It produced all of us, which I think is pretty great. But So one question is sort of, are there things that we're afraid of why we create permanency? And the other is, can we do more to not just look at our own history, which is obviously important to do, but to do that same thing into the future and try to imagine more what the future is going to look like. And would that change how many of us interact with the world around us? And so those are a couple of the kind of thoughts or questions that I've been having over the last week or two. I'd be really interested if, so I can share more about some of the different places I've been to if people want to hear that. But I'd also be interested if anybody listening has any thoughts on any of that, or has any thoughts of things that you've seen in your life, things that in the time that you were around them, they didn't look like they were changing. They just looked like they were, standing still, something static. And now, many years later, looking back, you can see how much something changed. I'd just be interested if anybody has any sort of thoughts or reactions to any of that. And then Phyllis, I'm happy to sort of go in any number of directions if there's anything that you think, would be interesting for me to talk more about.
I find it's fascinating what you're saying. And my own comments is people have a fear of the unknown, and the unknown is the future. And that's, last week we had someone speak about electric cars, and in 10, 15 years, you won't see any gas guzzlers anymore. I find that's difficult to believe, not because I don't believe in electric cars. I just keep wondering, what are they going to do with those cheap old cars?
They're going to be in museums.
There's so many.
It's true.
Anyway.
Yeah, that's definitely a big thing changing. And if I can add a thought there too, one of the things that I've noticed on a few times, even I've only been on the road for a week or two, and so I still have most of my trip ahead of me, but two different places, both in Montana and in North Dakota, we talk about electric cars and the automobile and the kind of impact that has had in so many different ways on our country and the way we all think about living and the way our communities are organized. And that we become very sort of intertwined. Our identity becomes very intertwined with these things. It's going to be very hard for a lot of people to give up a gas vehicle because for some reason they see it as part of themselves. When I was in Montana, talking with a colleague of mine who works right now in the energy industry, and they're doing a lot to try and bring more renewable energy, solar and wind, to Montana, which has historically been the eastern part of Montana. There's a little bit of oil. I mean, there's been a lot of coal mining in Montana. And it's very hard to get people thinking, hey, not only are we going to create a new job for you, it's going to be a job producing energy. It's just a new type of energy. And at the end of the day, all of this energy comes from the sun in one fashion or another, for the most part. And whether it has to wait, 50,000 years or 100,000 years or however long it takes to turn into coal or to turn into oil, we can just get this energy right now. I've got a solar panel on the roof that's keeping all of these things charged. But it's hard for people. And some folks that I talked to in North Dakota, it was the same about oil. Oil, there's so much oil in the western part of the state. It seemed like it was just a really big part. People followed all the, the prices of oil by the barrel and what was happening in the different markets around the world, things that I don't really follow on a daily basis, but it was such an important part of their daily livelihood that it was part of their culture at that point. And so I think one of the big challenges with electric vehicles or renewable energy or any of these things is how do you help people transition the culture from one thing to another, not just the product?
Wouldn't you say it's the young that will do that? Young people in the community.
They'll probably be pushing for it. And then, our children and grandchildren will be, pushing a new thing on us that I think it's probably going to be, unless we can sort of I don't know, unless we can find ways to deal with some of the uncertainty or unknown that you mentioned and sort of let some of these things change a little bit. I mean, I don't know. I think most people would say it's good that, we have Netflix and we don't have Blockbuster, that was a step forward. And, but it's hard to give those things up and actually believe it or not. So I used to be a consumer of Radio Shack. I don't know if you remember that store.
Of course.
They would sell the electronic gadgets and connectors and wires, and I see my mom is on this and she's laughing at that, and I'm sure my dad would too if he was on the video as well, because I feel like I was always going back and forth to Radio Shack. Now you have to get that stuff, I don't know, on Amazon, I guess, but there's actually an open Radio Shack out here. And it's one of the, I think it's one of the only ones left. And it's an actual Radio Shack, and I didn't know there were any left. So that was kind of cool.
That is interesting.
But it's part of a different culture, right? It's part of this do-it-yourself DIY culture. And that's one of the things that I've found, from traveling to different urban areas and rural areas, that's a big difference in the more rural areas, is that a lot of people, they fix their own vehicles. They, in the winter and you get snowed in, there's nobody to call. There's no plow, there's no public works department coming by. If you need to get out, you have to figure out a way to get out. And that is something that is changed a lot. I think, I only saw, I feel lucky with my generation because I remember, getting a cell phone. I think it was in high school that had, 30 minutes a month, and I was only allowed to call my parents on it, and it had Snake on it, and that was it. But I remember using payphones before that, and I remember dial-up internet, and I remember not having internet before that, and that's not the case anymore. Kids now, and now I guess I'm allowed to, if I'm in my 30s, I'm allowed to start saying kids these days, they don't know that side of things. And so that's changing so rapidly, but we're not really talking about the changes. And I feel like part of, the concern that people have about the uncertainty is that we sort of allow it to move forward really quickly, but we don't really admit it. We don't really admit that it's happening. And we just sort of kind of shut our eyes to it, and it just keeps spiraling and things keep moving. And I guess something that I wish, and I wonder if people have thoughts on this, of could we do these things where we talk about them as we do them, talk about the pros and cons, say, is this change really the best thing for us? Or is it not? We're just sort of, again, with our eyes forward, just going as fast as possible forward. And I wonder if there's any way on a community level, maybe not on a national level or on a global level, but could we talk about these things? Is that possible for people to do?
It depends where you live. I think big government dictates a lot. So in a small town, you have a better chance of changing things as compared to a huge community, New York, San Francisco, Boston.
I think that's true.
What?
It'd be kind of interesting to know if the Radio Shack that's still in that town is there because of a concerted effort to keep it there.
Yeah, that would be worth following up on. Like, I wonder if it was all closing and then people in the community got together and said, no, you're not taking our Radio Shack. That would be pretty interesting. Or maybe it'd be interesting to know one way or the other, if it was that, or if it was sort of natural, like maybe they were doing enough business that people said, why close it? They're making money. They're the only one left making money. Yeah, it is interesting. And the government does have a role with these things. There's some countries in Western Europe, I think there's some Scandinavian countries that have begun to talk about something called a right to repair law. And it's very early making its rounds in the United States, but it's basically the idea that, you buy a cell phone now or any computer, you can't really take it apart. You can't really do anything with it. You used to be able to fix things yourself. And now if you take something apart, sometimes that voids the warranty. You're not allowed to do that. And excuse me, what some of these laws are meant to help encourage is companies building products that when they break, you don't just throw them into a landfill somewhere, but you can take the one piece out that's broken and put a new piece in. Even if that doesn't make the company the most amount of money possible, it would have a better environmental benefit because it would reduce waste. And it would also give people a little bit of the chance to, take a little ownership over some of the things around them, and learn how to fix things and maybe learn some of those skills, which could be good for people.
First, they'd have to learn how to use it. And that, unfortunately, technology is going so quickly that only the young seem to catch on really quickly. And so they could afford to take the time to fix a computer or change something that they want to. The older people, I'm intimidated by it. I act like if I touch something wrong, it's going to break. I hate to say it, it probably will. That's why I only use it when I have to.
Yeah, I do wonder if some of the really younger kids, generations in their teens now, if they would even be interested in wanting to repair something, or if they've been raised in a culture that's so focused on getting the next thing that that's not really, I mean, at some point, right, it's not even going to be a thought anymore. I think that we forget over generations, some of these ideas just evaporate from our kind of collective culture. And so it's possible in a decade or two, nobody will even repairing an electronic thing. Maybe nobody will even have heard of it at that point. And none of the younger people will. And it'll just be totally, if something's broken, you just get a new thing.
Or even if
I
it's
think
not,
I'd be sad to see that.
Even if it's not broken, move on to the next
right.
one. So
things are almost always broken after day one to some degree, right? Because they become, obsolete. They start to become not the newest thing as soon as they become yours. And so, maybe it's not actually broken, but the fact that there's a new thing out and it's got better features, that makes it feel like what you have is broken. But we're moving through things so rapidly, and it's hard. I mean, again, I feel lucky because I just caught the tail end of the prior culture that I think did have more permanence, had a longer outlook on some of these things, didn't throw out products every year for new ones. I feel lucky that I just caught the tail end of that, but I know, there's some folks listening here that's more a part of the culture of how they were raised. And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, but it just seems interesting. It seems so different than some of the cultures now.
Did you ever have a TV repairman come to your house to fix a television?
That's a good question. I don't think so.
That's what they used to do.
No, yeah. I don't think that ever happened in our house.
It happened in our house.
TV repairman. Yeah, that's a thing. I mean, I don't think that's a thing anymore, even.
No, but that was a business for people until they had things that were more difficult to fix, I suppose. Different.
Or maybe things that were built in a way that they were valuable enough you want to keep them for longer.
Right. Well, you have so much to say about your trips and everything. Why wouldn't you be writing a book about this trip? Or do you think the podcast is what is?
Well, it's funny. So that's a good question. The podcast is definitely part of that. And part of that because I like to be able to show some of the photos and stuff of where I'm going, and things like that. And but I am writing a book, and it actually I've written quite a bit over the last few days, and some of what I'm doing now is actually getting incorporated into this, which I wasn't really expecting. So I don't know if I'm going to write something specifically about this, but some of the thoughts and the ideas and the lessons are getting moved into this sort of science fiction book as well. But I'll certainly have a little bit written up. And Phyllis, if you want me to send that to you when I have that written, it won't be very long. It won't be all the details, but it'll be sort of a summary.
I'd love it. I'm fascinated.
Okay.
By it. And also all the things that you're saying about traveling is such an enlightening thing, because you're meeting people that you have never met before with completely different interests, and that you learn from others and how they are. And you have to be open-minded.
And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think you also have to be very brave, because I see you like in that isolated area, and I keep thinking, what happens if you get a flat tire? I mean,
Yeah,
it's not too bad here. It's not too bad here, but my one only real concern, and so far so good, has been there's a lot of bears and other wildlife that I don't know how often they come down to the campgrounds. The bears do sometimes, because they come for food, and they're not black bears, they're grizzly bears, which are a little bit more intimidating. Yeah, and so actually the campground, which is a very smart move on their part, is they at each of the campsites they have metal containers bolted into the ground for you to store all your food in. They have handles, and they're like in the ground. The bears can't open them, but they still do come down. And so when you're hiking, you have to be kind of on the lookout, for all those things, because there's bears. There's also wild cats, like bobcats, and some maybe mountain lions and things like that too, which so you have to be a little careful for those sorts of things. But that's you read. So there's a plaque down here, and I want to see, I'm not going to pronounce his name the right way. Hold on one second here. So there was a man here and who I guess like sort of settled this area, who was from Switzerland, and suggested that the mountains here sort of felt like home because of all these kind of jagged peaks and everything, and all the lakes everywhere, and there's waterfalls and stuff. And this was in the 1890s. There are some stories on the signage here about how he was summiting all of these mountains here. I think there was like 200 peaks in all that he summited in the 1890s. No trails, no U.S. Forest Service, he was making his own maps. None of the knowledge that we have. I mean, think about that kind of, like, that blows my mind to think about walking up in these woods, in the 1800s without anything at all, other than your hands, I don't know, some tools to protect you. So that's pretty incredible. Like, people were capable of that then. I would assume that we could theoretically be capable of that now too.
I want to know, do you carry aerosol cans to spray at the bears? Or?
Yeah. That's one of the important things that to carry, and hopefully that hopefully you don't need it. But I was an area yesterday around a lake where you sort of hike up, and there's a river that runs along the hiking trail, and there's all these lakes that I don't think, humans have never developed. There's like never been around there. They're just pristine, clean water. And one of the other hikers I passed said that she had seen a bunch of signs of bear activity in the area. So everybody was sort of, just keeping an extra eye out. So
you live with it.
Yeah, some people say that you're supposed to sing on a trail, and that scares the bears away. I think if I were to sing on the trail, that would scare the people away too. So I'm probably not going to do that.
That's funny. If only you knew what song to sing that they would love.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I don't want to sing them, and then the bears come out and say, "Yeah, I love this song."
And how much food do you bring in your trailers? This is another thing. Do you go shopping?
I have a lot of food. So I had a lot of leftover when I moved out. So I have a lot of sort of dry food and canned food and stuff. So, you know, I have more than I usually take when I go camping, but probably several weeks worth of food at least.
You really do?
So
Oh,
usually what I'll try to stop into like a local grocery store. And so, you know, in Montana and in this area, there's a lot of cattle. So when you go to the grocery store and you go to like the meat section, you know, one of the things that I've tried to do more and more is only eat meat that has been, you know, raised in a non-industrial setting. And so if you go to a grocery store here or things like that, it's a little easier. Actually, where I lived in New Jersey, there were so many farms around me. It was very easy to find local food. So I have like some canned food, you know, beans and rice and pasta and all sorts of things like that. And then I will kind of mix that with something I can get locally, ideally something that is local. So if I'm buying, you know, beer or anything like that, I try to only get something that's just from the area that I'm in, which is something we could probably all, you know, something I've been trying to do more of. And yeah, and it's kind of a fun way to experience some of the different places you're going to also.
and what place do you want to go back to in years to come?
Well, I'm going to want to come back here. I think it's going to get pretty crowded here because it's Memorial Day weekend. I just realized yesterday, as I was looking at potentially going elsewhere, I was going to go up to a national park, but I decided against that because it's just going to be, I think it's going to be way too crowded. So this was really nice because there hasn't been too many people here so far. There's only been a few. So I probably will want to come back here and do some more fishing, which I haven't done much of. The water is really cold. It was like snow very recently, so it is just like freezing in there. But I imagine later in the summer it's probably really nice. So on from here, I might go up to northern Montana, and then I'm going out to Washington and the Seattle area, and then Portland and Oregon, and then the redwood forests in California, and then down the coast of California. And then I'm meeting up with a friend, and we're going to do some kind of visiting and staying in a few different places in Arizona and then Utah, camping at the Grand Canyon, some things like that. And so that's sort of what I have ahead of me the next couple of weeks. And then I'm not sure after that, I'll probably want to come back up around here, Wyoming and Montana. It's just, I mean, I've never seen any environments like this. Like for the couple people, let's see, for the couple people that are on the video here, I don't have many pictures yet. They're all my camera. But I can show you a brief. So this is a hiking trail. It's just a little dirt path on one side with the sort of mountains on the other side. And that's, you know, that's sort of what it looks like out here. And so, and if you're able to see this is actually the valley that I'm in right now. So I'm somewhere in here. So this is just really beautiful here. I'm probably going to want to come back, is my guess.
Well, it was fascinating. I think that the best part will be when you go down the coast of California.
That would be
Civilization
really nice.
and all the modern things that you don't have to keep the spray can and worry about bears.
You know, the bears, you know, it's I would say they're less worrisome than the other worries of society. You know, I think there's so much anxiety. There's so many, I don't know, there's so much, you know, I turn my phone on for a minute to come and do this, and you just see news about things. And you know, the bears actually, I can sort of understand with, you know, it's sort of all logical to some degree. I mean, they can be unpredictable too, but it seems like chaos, but it's really not. Like, it's actually, I don't know, there's something very sort of peaceful and settled, because what these bears have been, I mean, they've been doing this for hundreds of thousands of years. It's all been happening just like this. And so they seem to be at peace with it, at least.
Do you get newspapers?
Although I guess I'd be at peace too if I was a bear.
Do you buy newspapers from the different towns, or you just read online?
I do sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes if I'm like going to like get lunch somewhere and I can grab like a local, especially
I
like
was
a local circulation thing. I try to listen to local radio stations as I've been traveling. That's something I've been doing more this trip that I haven't done as much in the past, and just hear what they're talking about on the local radio stations. And that's kind of interesting too. You just get a little bit of a flavor for, what's on people's minds.
Do you get the sense that that the local papers are connected in the way that you are to what's going on in the world, in the country, and the world?
Well, that's a good question. I think it varies considerably from place to place, and probably at different publications from time to time. Maybe a few decades ago, I would have given a more resounding yes. 10 or 20 years ago, that the papers, they had more reporters and they were like on more, and they weren't on the internet as much. They weren't letting that drive the kind of content that they were covering. But now I think, in having written for a local paper, in South Orange, Maplewood, there were different pressures. They had so few staff, and over the last few years, in my work as a town administrator in two different towns in New Jersey, neither of those communities had a local paper, whereas South Orange and Maplewood had several. Not only the News Record in print, but you have the Village Green, you have Tap Into, you had the Patch for a while. There was a couple others. You had a lot of local media. Some of these communities, even in New Jersey, they don't have anything. And so the coverage of the news in those places, I trust less, because it's one person who's got 100 different assignments, and it's not their fault. In most cases, I think they've got too much on their plate. And so I'm not sure how deep into the community that they get. But like I was reading just now, I've been wanting to read. So this area, and you can't really see it from here that well, but this entire valley, about 25 years ago, there was a enormous wildfire that went through this whole area. And basically all the trees, everything got burned. There was a handful that survived. Most of the houses down by the lake burned down. And it was one of the worst fires it sounded like they had seen here. And so I had bumped into someone who has a vacation home around here the other day, and we were talking, and I asked him, because it looked like there had been fires, as I'm walking around in the woods, and he mentioned that there was, and, we talked a little bit about it, but then I got to come on the internet here and look up some stories about it and read a little more. And those were like really detailed accounts of everything, but they were from the stories were from over 20 years ago. And so I don't know. I think that we're losing a little bit of the thoroughness. And again, it's not the individual reporters or journalists' fault in most cases. I think it's just that there's fewer staff working to do the same amount of stuff. And my personal belief, and I'm not just saying this because I'm here with the library, but something that I've been working on a little bit, is how do libraries become more central flows of information in communities? Is that something that libraries could do? I think libraries do a lot more than what most people think they do. Obviously, Phyllis, people on this call know that it's more than just a place with books that you can go borrow. And trying to think about what libraries can do. And like South Orange does a lot. The communities that I worked in, the libraries did so much stuff. And in all these communities, like the ones that I worked in, there's a breakdown of conversation about what's happening in the community. And there's no local newspaper to facilitate any sort of discussion. So you have one side versus the other side of all the local issues. And there's no newspaper saying, well, here's what some people think, and here's what some people think, and we did our own investigation, and here's what we found out. There's nobody doing that in a lot of these small towns. But there are libraries in all of these small towns. And so my thought, and people, I think, trust libraries more than they trust other government institutions. So my kind of question is, can libraries play a role in helping facilitate information, maybe alongside newspapers more? Is there more that we could do there in the future? So that's part of the thinking about what things are going to look like in years in the future. What are libraries going to look like at years in the future?
Hopefully they'll do exactly what you say to educate people. You were wonderful. It was so terrific. And I do hope you send me all the information because like I say, with
I'll do
podcasts,
that.
I'll try it. I'll have someone, Michael is good at teaching me how to get on for, right, Michael?
On 4.
What? Or to have a podcast, I mean, not to have a podcast, to listen to this. I love to hear your podcasts because they're fascinating. So thank you so much for devoting so much time and effort to us when you have all that beautiful scenery to go to and travel. And I think you're terrific. It sounds fascinating what you're doing with your life and with your educating other people. So thank you. And when you come back to South Orange, you'll come back to the library and give us, we'll be in a new library, maybe with a nice meeting room. You never know.
That would be fun. And, I'll take you up on that, Phyllis. I appreciate all the kind words you said. And you know what I will do is for that, I will get some of the pictures printed out and I'll bring them in.
Thank you
and
so
we can
much.
check it out in person. Hopefully when we can back be, to doing that.
Well, thank you. Have a great weekend. All of you, be safe, be
Thank
healthy,
you.
happy,
Enjoy it and be safe.